Senator Fulbright won some amendments to FARA in 1966, concentrated on preserving the integrity of U.S. policymaking. These were based on the comprehensive findings of the Foreign Relations Committee hearings, which explored the foreign agents of many countries in addition to Israel's. The 1966 amendments now required any person who was engaged in defined political activities to register as a foreign agent. But this vastly narrowed the original FARA, which had not required that foreign agent activities necessarily be for or on behalf of the foreign principal. Fulbright offered another disturbing finding concerning foreign agent campaign contributions drawn from his investigation. John A. O'Donnell was one of two American members of a post-war commission created to arbitrate damage claims under the 1946 Philippine Rehabilitation Act. Ernest Schein was the commission's chief examiner. Fulbright discovered during closed testimony that O'Donnell had agreed to work on further claims for the Philippines less than 4 months after the commission was disbanded. Together with Schein, he obtained payments of over $1 million through 1960, representing foreign principals, without registering under FARA. These payments were in fact derived from U.S. damage awards paid to Filipino Catholic organizations in 1946 and 1952. The awards recycled to the lobbyists from 23 religious clients and amounting to about 10% of awards already received were used to press for further aid. In 1963, Fulbright attached provisions to a $73 million appropriation to the Philippines, stipulating that it would be the final liquidation of all damage claims and that none could be dispersed to individual claimants. O'Donnell had doled out $7,100 in campaign contributions during the 1960 congressional elections from his lobbying fees. Fulbright sought to ban such contributions outright. However, the case of Abraham Feinberg's expanding exclusive and government-approved business concessions in Israel, even as he continued to be the point person for presidential campaign contributions, reveals that the Fulbright attempt largely failed. Complex and opaque on- and offshore financial flows were impossible to monitor. Lobbyists such as Isaiah Kennan and the American Israel Public Affairs Committee probably followed FARA proceedings directed at other countries closely, even as they were caught up in the Senate foreign agent investigations. But after the preferential American Zionist Council registration, the Israel lobby operated under a different set of rules. AIPAC developed a vast, more distributed array of capabilities than the average Latin American lobbyist could muster, though one lesson that clearly emerged from the Dominican Republic's intersection with the First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy was the age-old utility of hooking points. The more involved and ingratiated foreign lobbyists could become in high officialdom, the less likely they were to ever be seriously prosecuted for FARA-related crimes, up to and including espionage. Between 2005 and the year 2008, this tactic would be tested to the hilt in pretrial maneuvers, defending two AIPAC officials against indictments brought under the 1917 Espionage Act. The defense was finally granted the right to call high-ranking Bush administration officials to testify, a tactic that almost guaranteed presidential pardons or dismissal of the case for lack of witnesses if all invoked executive branch prerogatives not to appear. Isaiah Kennan retired from AIPAC in 1974. The same year, a report from the Government Accounting Office revealed an obvious FARA weakness. The compliance section was almost totally reliant on the timely, complete, and accurate disclosure of foreign agents' activities. FARA had the power to issue deficiency notices, initiate investigations, and refer violators for possible criminal investigation. But assuming the good faith of foreign agents and the political will of an administration to prosecute violators continued to be FARA's Achilles heel. Two high-profile scandals underscored the inherently elite nature of FARA violations and the political difficulties in strict application of the law. Marian Javits, the wife of Senator Jacob K. Javits, filed a deceptively crafted FARA registration designed to cover the legal exposures but mask the true nature of her lobbying for Iran. It nevertheless ended in disaster. Billy Carter, brother of President James Earl Jimmy Carter, Jr., like Kennan, didn't bother to register at all for his lobbying on behalf of Libya. Both provided comic tragic theater, signaling that the days of FARA penalties for violators were coming to an end. In 1974, Marian Javits, a retired actress 21 years younger than her husband, with little experience in public relations, crafted a $507,500 proposal for the Shah of Iran on behalf of the firm Rutter & Finn. In a People magazine interview the same year, she stressed that her skills were not law or public relations, but rather more people-oriented. She said, "So I am socially involved in what goes on in my society, but I'm not a social worker, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't choose to be an actress. But I'm playing a role." Senator Jacob K. Javits' role at the time was ranking Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee. Marian was a friend of the Shah's sister, Princess Ashraf Pahlavi. Miss Javits suggested that bad publicity about Iran buying up all the armaments in sight produced attitudes that are both real and prejudicial. She proposed an educational program directed at the opinion makers of this country, to community leaders, political figures, and the national major media, and the broad general public. To stem growing U.S. awareness of the brutal repression of the Shah's regime maintained by the Savak secret police, Javits wanted to promote several somewhat mutually exclusive concepts. The fact is that the Shah, even though he is in a sense an absolute ruler, has highly constructive social goals, and under the conditions that exist in Iran, the only way to accomplish these goals is by tight control, firm leadership, and detailed national planning. And he does this with benevolence and compassion. Parvez C. Raji, an aide to Iranian Prime Minister Hoveyda, wrote the Prime Minister a frank note on May of 1975. He wrote, "I think the performance of this plan is advisable, even if its only result will be to pour money in the pocket of Miss Javits." Both Raji and Hoveyda understood that the real objective, detailed in a top-secret memo, was to obtain private access to Congress, key politicians, governors, Democratic and Republican Party leaders, universities, and above all, the elite press. Raji wrote to Hoveyda, "Mrs. Javits herself, who has many contacts with America's news media officials and first-class writers, will play a major role." The Shah personally approved the contract while vacationing at a St. Moritz ski resort, conspiratorially noting that because they are Jewish, this should be kept confidential. Princess Ashraf Pahlavi was to announce the good news to Marian Javits at a private luncheon while stressing the absolute need for secrecy in the matter. As an added precaution, the payments should be channeled through Iran Air, the airline owned by the government of Iran. The unit of Savak based in New York immediately detected a fatal blow to the venture. Marian Javits went ahead and registered as a foreign agent for Iran Air with the U.S. Department of Justice. The Village Voice quickly reviewed the registration and broke the news in, quote, "a disgusting manner," at least according to Savak's U.S. agents. In January of 1976, broadcast news networks picked up the story, and Rutter & Finn was forced to terminate the contract in March. Marian Javits resigned as the senior vice president of Rutter & Finn on January 27, and Senator Javits sheepishly expressed his regrets over the sordid affair. The prime minister and other Iranians involved in the transaction had intended that the PR campaign be carefully guarded, or put another way, done the way Israel did it. Given their agent was Marian Javits, they had every reason to hope for success. Rutter & Finn was a logical stealth partner for the operation. It had quietly begun providing public relations services to the Israel Office of Information in July of 1967. Shortly after the Six-Day War, the Israeli consulate operation massively ramped up PR efforts and the budget in the U.S. to create a positive public image of Israeli heroics in America. But the damaging details of both sides of the Javits deal soon became public. In Iran, quite unexpectedly. After the Shah was overthrown in the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the Ayatollah Khomeini's regime was only too happy to publicly release all of the secret memos on the matter. The Javits FARA registration and the resultant public scrutiny clearly doomed the entire Iran project, showing that FARA, though imperfect, functioned when foreign agents actually filed. It was this type of spotlight that Billy Carter, brother of President Jimmy Carter, sought to avoid by not filing his dealings on behalf of Libya. Billy Carter launched his comical lobbying foray during another periodic lull in FARA enforcement. In 1964, even after the outcome of the Fulbright hearings, active registrants only numbered around 400. By 1980, the number had increased to 700, but with no proportionate increase in FARA section staff. Indeed, the Department of Justice's enforcement policies and attitudes seem to be softening, if not rotting from within. The Department of Justice sought future changes to FARA, in particular replacing the term propaganda with less pejorative terms, such as information. FARA enforcement was further hobbled by a 1976 court case in which a federal judge, John J. Sirica, ruled that a law firm acting as a foreign agent for Guinea could claim attorney-client privilege over relevant documents. The firm representing the foreign principal, Covington and Burlington, had refused to turn over 1,000 documents the Ghanaian government did not want released. This overturned a precedent set in 1972, allowing broad latitude for the FARA section to inspect the records of the Irish Northern Aid Committee. FARA had been amended to permit such inspections since the, quote, national defense, internal security, and foreign relations of the United States, unquote, outweighed possible infringements on First Amendment rights to free speech. However, the Guinea victory meant that no future Senate investigators would probably ever again rifle through a foreign agent's filing cabinet like Fulbright's had. Covington and Burlington's successful challenge to FARA is also ironic. Nathan B. Lenvin urged Judge Rifkin to consider that registration never hurt Governor Dewey or the law firm of Covington and Burlington, and he said that there was no stigma for proper disclosure. High-profile law firms clearly thought otherwise. A Justice Department filing against Billy Carter stated that he had undertaken a propaganda campaign on behalf of Libya's foreign policy objectives and had received more than $220,000 for services rendered. Like the Dominican Republic in the early 1960s, Libya was experiencing a serious diplomatic rift. U.S. diplomats were withdrawn from Libya in 1979, and the U.S. State Department forced the return of 4 Libyans present in the U.S. for acting as unofficial diplomats. Libya was also actively opposing Carter's Camp David peace initiative between Israel and the Palestinians. Billy Carter made 2 all-expense-paid trips to Libya in September and October of 1979. There, he received a ceremonial sword, gold bracelets, and a saddle worth more than $2,000, among other lavish gifts. Billy Carter testified that the $220,000 was simply part of a $500,000 loan he had requested from Libya, though his lawyers could produce no loan agreements or other written substantiation. After an 18-month investigation, rather than prosecuting, the Justice Department sought civil sanctions, forcing the immediate and full public disclosure of his activities. Under a consent agreement, Billy Carter registered as a foreign agent for Libya on July 14, 1980, without admitting or denying charges. By the mid-1970s, FARA's full potential criminal sanctions were accurately portrayed as rarely pursued. But when they were applied, they tended to target parties with little organized domestic political muscle. On February 19, 1976, the Arab Information Center and its director, Amin Hilmi, were charged with violating FARA for alleged propaganda efforts on behalf of the Arab League. Charges leveled in federal court stated that the center had distributed advertisements in U.S. newspapers without required notification that it was acting on behalf of a foreign principal. The Department of Justice did not criminally prosecute the Arab Information Center, but asked for an injunction requiring compliance with FARA. The center was asked to notify readers of the Department of Justice's action in new ads, including the proper FARA disclosure. Another Department of Justice effort to enforce alleged FARA violations began in 1975, was thwarted by a ruling and case dismissal based on successful statute of limitations arguments. A Michigan-based media entrepreneur received $11 million through a Swiss bank account to purchase U.S. news media interests on behalf of apartheid South Africa. His efforts to purchase the Washington Star, now defunct newspaper, in order to counter perceived hostile reporting in the Washington Post were rebuffed. But in 1975, John McGough bought a controlling stake in the United Press International television news agency with $1.35 million in funds provided by South Africa's Department of Information. McGough decried the 1979 FBI and grand jury investigations as a government attempt to muzzle his personal views on foreign policy. McGough ultimately prevailed in a criminal FARA prosecution against him that did not get underway until the mid-1980s. Federal courts dismissed the case after determining that the statute of limitations had run out. By the 1990s, FARA enforcement was clearly dying a slow death, undermined by powerful lobbyists, attorney-client privilege, and foreign-influence domestic interest groups. It would soon only be applied to the weakest of violators working on behalf of out-of-favor countries. Even then, prosecution would only be launched if it was in line with clear administration foreign policy doctrine. This would guarantee at least a minimal appearance of enforcement, as constitutionally required, while making sure no potentially embarrassing elite political scandals would surface. The American section of the Jewish Agency operated out of its New York City office at 515 Park Avenue into the early 1970s. Isidore Hamlin continued to function as the executive director of the American section and file the required FARA declarations. But the American Zionist Council Department of Justice confrontation had put a spotlight on the Jewish Agency's activities, and the corporate veil Hamlin and Boekstein had woven was finally beginning to slip. On June 9, 1969, Hamlin responded to a FARA question about the nature of the foreign principal he represented and attached an exhibit explaining why that principal was not a foreign government. The document read, American Section, Jewish Agency for Israel, Inc. The executive of the Jewish Agency for Israel is the executive arm of the World Zionist Organization, which, through its constituent member organizations throughout the free world, representing Jews from all over the world principally concerned with immigration, rehabilitation, and resettlement of Jewish settlers and refugees in Israel, with cultural activities in Israel and in other countries, the dissemination of information related to its activities, and the welfare of the people of Israel. The World Zionist Organization is recognized by the State of Israel as the representative body of Jews outside of Israel for the purposes of immigration, rehabilitation, colonization, and resettlement of Jewish immigrants to Israel. A special law to that effect was passed by the Knesset of Israel in 1962, and an agreement setting forth the areas of cooperation between the executive of the Jewish Agency and the government of Israel in respect to the foregoing functions of the agency was entered into in July of 1953. The Jewish Agency for Israel is not an instrumentality or a subdivision of the state or government of Israel. Hamlin acknowledged that the Israeli government funded the Jewish Agency, but he would not concede any implicit Israeli government control. He wrote, The government of Israel has, from time to time, made subventions to the Jewish Agency for Israel, particularly in connection with its work in agricultural settlements and immigrant housing. These subventions varied in amounts from time to time. In all cases, control over the operations, subventioned by the government, remained fully with the Jewish Agency. George Washington University law professor William T. Mallison Jr. knew nothing about the Jewish Agency, but received an informal evening briefing from the American Council for Judaism's Rabbi Elmer Berger about the legal issues surrounding the plight of Palestinian refugees. Mallison began focusing on a pointed legal analysis on the underpinnings of the foreign agency relationship between the Israeli government and the Jewish Agency. He felt that FARA required far deeper Jewish Agency disclosures than had been previously filed. Rabbi Elmer Berger wrote, "This persistent blinking of the harder and harder evidence we continued to submit, identifying the Zionist apparatus as a supranational tool of the Israeli government, led us to conceive and develop Mallison's second major study. This argued that the status law and covenant made the Zionist apparatus either an agent of the Israeli government or actually part of the government. When Mallison completed his second study, slightly different versions were submitted to both the Department of Justice and the Department of State. The facts and law comprising the body of both petitions were identical. The petitions for relief were tailored to the competencies of each department. At Justice, we asked that the Foreign Agents Registration Act be enforced against the Zionist apparatus in the United States. At the State Department, we contended that the organized, systematic intervention of the Israeli government in the lives of American Jews using the Zionist apparatus was a violation of the Treaty of Friendship and Commerce. At two places in that treaty, it is clearly stipulated that the parties were enjoined from carrying on political activity in each other's territory," wrote the rabbi. In August of 1969, after he read the Jewish Agency's FARA declaration, Mallison's report pressured the Department of Justice to compel Isidore Hamlin to file the 1953 agreement entered into between the Israeli government and the Jewish Agency. Mallison also signed out and examined the public portions of the American Zionist Council's file on September 3rd of 1969. The FARA section's internal withdrawal form duly noted that this was only a consultation of AZC's informational material. Mallison based his request on the FARA law then in effect, which required registrants to reveal how they were supervised, directed, owned, controlled, financed, or subsidized in whole or in part by any government of a foreign country. Since registering in 1938, the Jewish Agency had entirely evaded filing such documents. The Justice Department subsequently compelled the American section to file its covenant with the Israeli government as part of its 1969 registration statement. Senator J.W. Fulbright requested such documents from the executive in Israel during the course of the May 23, 1960 hearings, but both Hamlin and Boekstein successfully steered him away from the actual covenant. The forced filing of the covenant in 1969 for the first time revealed the extraordinary quasi-governmental powers of the Jewish Agency to independently raise tax preferential funds for its purposes, encourage capital investments in the State of Israel, coordinate Jewish organizations in Israel, establish new institutions as needed, and even review government legislation before it was submitted to the Knesset. By the time Hamlin filed the covenant, the Jewish Agency American Section, Inc. budget was approximately $35 million. However, the Jewish Agency itself, funded by tax-exempt United Jewish Appeal donations from across the U.S. and other worldwide donations, was one of the best finance organizations in the world. One observer called the Jewish Agency a shadow government. However, as was the norm, no fine or penalty for years of deficient filings was sought by the Department of Justice against the Jewish Agency. The added sunshine only led to the paper demise of the American section, but it was quickly and somewhat cynically reborn. In 1971, the Jewish Agency American Section, Inc. notified the Justice Department that it would no longer file under FARA. Operations were functionally passed on to a new registrant, the World Zionist Organization, American Section, Inc. No major contemporary news accounts chronicled this quiet FARA Jewish Agency movement, perhaps because the transition was so quiet and seamless. In fact, Isidore Hamlin did not even bother changing his office address when the new front organization took over. The World Zionist Organization, American Section, Inc., registered on September 21, 1971, as a foreign agent for the executive of the World Zionist Organization in Israel. The World Zionist Organization executive in Israel claimed to be the parent organization of the Jewish Agency. The WZO claimed not to be owned, directed, controlled, or financed by any foreign government, and this claim in its FARA filings has not been challenged. Isidore Hamlin, executive director of the Jewish Agency American Section, subsequently became the executive director of this new FARA registrant. The World Zionist Organization immediately took over the publication and distribution of the Israel Digest and occupied the Jewish Agency's former space at 515 Park Avenue in New York City. W.T. Mallison Jr., the lawyer who pierced the corporate veil alongside Rabbi Elmer Berger, reflected on the elaborate shell game in 1988. He wrote, "Until 1971, the Zionist registrant under the FARA was the American section of the Jewish Agency for Israel, registrant number 208. Its initial and supplementary registration statements did not include the status law or the covenant, and therefore did not meet the requirements of Section 2A2. During the period 1968-1970, administrative proceedings were instituted before the Department of Justice to compel compliance, initially on behalf of the American Council for Judaism, then the principal anti-Zionist Jewish organization in the United States, and subsequently on behalf of American Jewish Alternatives to Zionism. In spite of the strenuous Zionist opposing arguments, registrant number 208 was compelled to file both the status law and the covenant on August 28, 1969. Those two consecutive documents demonstrated that the agent was not the voluntary private organization which it claimed to be. On June 9, 1970, the Department of Justice also required the filing of the tax appendix to the covenant. Subsequent actions of the Zionist organization, Jewish Agency, demonstrated its concern over these developments. In 1971, there was a reorganization of the Jewish Agency, which resulted in changing its name for at least some purposes to the reconstituted Jewish Agency. The apparent purpose was to give the appearance of equal control by the Zionist political and non-Zionist philanthropic operations of the disposition of funds raised by the Jewish Agency and its subordinate institutions. During that same year, the American section of the Jewish Agency, registrant number 208, deregistered under the FARA on the alleged grounds that it was no longer engaged in political activities. Following that action, the Zionist organization Jewish Agency registered under the name World Zionist Organization, American Section, Inc., as registrant number 2278. Registrant number 208 had consistently listed its foreign principal as the executive of the Jewish Agency for Israel, Jerusalem, Israel, whereas registrant number 2278 has consistently listed its foreign principal as the executive of the World Zionist Organization, Jerusalem, Israel. In short, the foreign principle of the past and present registrants is identical, although the wording is different. The important change in the new registration is that neither the status law nor the covenant nor the tax appendix has been filed initially or subsequently, although the foreign principle is the same as that of the prior registrant, and the specifics of the registration statements of the past and present registrants provide persuasive evidence that the foreign agents, the registrants, are the same or substantially the same, wrote Mallison. Isidore Hamlin moved some boxes on his organization chart, rather than between cities or even buildings, by reversing the subsidiary and controlling corporate entities. Then it was business as usual. There was still the urgent need for an entity to continue Jewish agency operations in the United States. The WZO's 1972 Congress revealed its goal to intensify consistent ideological and public relations guidance from the foreign principle at the regional and country levels. It said, Congress instructs the executive that wherever it is represented at international Jewish conventions, every effort should be made to put the Zionist point of view forcibly and to ensure that it prevails. And to this end, it considers it essential that the representatives of the executive and the Zionist movement generally should consult together before and, if necessary, during such conventions in order to frame a common line of policy. There would be no interruption in U.S. operations, as the World Zionist Organization also formally asserted the prerogative of Zionists to assume leading positions across all Jewish organizations outside of Israel. Zionists are entitled to a privileged position among the Jewish organizations in the diaspora and should be given advisory status in the forming of Israel's external and internal politics. It is useful to again review why the Jewish agency World Zionist Organization was involved in financial flows to finance the Near East Report, run public relations campaigns, and indirectly finance U.S. lobbying activity when at least one node of the foreign agency network would likely be compelled to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. By centralizing fundraising in the United Israel Appeal and United Jewish Appeal for exclusive conveyance to the Jewish agency in Israel, top Israel lobby leadership in the U.S. moved the funds offshore, outside U.S. jurisdiction, and also separated control from contentious U.S. Jewish humanitarian aid and relief groups. While Isaiah Kennan's organization, the American Zionist Council, was an umbrella for powerful U.S.-based fundraising groups, the fact that Isaiah Kennan was unable to tap significant funds directly from U.S. donors early on is telling. Only by moving the tax-exempt funds offshore could they sever control and knowledge of the fund's true destination from domestic source groups. They then quietly moved these and other international funds back into U.S. public relations efforts, think tanks, and lobbying activities. The offshore component enabled Kennan's and the Israel lobby operatives total freedom of movement to secretly pursue activities as they saw fit, rather than by the committee consensus that hobbled predecessor organizations. Once the groups could show lobbying success and document results, direct access to U.S. funding sources was obtained. Indeed, this was the pattern up to the reorganization of the Jewish Agency American section. By the early 1970s, AIPAC was able to actually lay claim to less risky, non-tax-deductible domestic funding and publicize that for each dollar invested, a large multiple would be sent to Israel. Only now is the burden of all U.S. taxpayers. Trial by fire means that AIPAC wisely no longer claims to be an umbrella group leveraging the collective membership of constituent organizations. In 2008, AIPAC claimed only 100,000 members, a fraction of the 750,000 members AZC trumpeted as an umbrella group in 1965, and 76,000 less than Louis Brandeis first assembled in 1919. In retrospective, the core activist Zionist movement of Isaiah Kennan resembles the modern neoconservative movement. Razor-thin, smart, extremely well-financed, ably diffused in mainstream media, but curiously unrepresentative of any actual American grassroots following. Only the names have changed, as Republican megadonor magnate Sheldon Adelson and Democratic Party Israeli-American media mogul Haim Saban stepped in to fill the void left by Abraham J. Feinberg. AIPAC's effort to display from the mid-1970s onward a quasi-independent public image had many other advantages. The trauma and legal exposures of the American Zionist Council and Jewish Agency American section could now be avoided. Should the need arise, AIPAC's core assets and its membership database, operating processes, and relationships management could be quickly shifted into a new shell corporation without damaging the image of the Zionist Organization of America, Hadassah, or other related membership organizations. These hard-learned lessons about agility would loom and provide options when the Department of Justice debated whether to indict AIPAC as a corporation rather than singling out key executives during the 2005 espionage scandal. Fortunately for the Israel lobby, few in Congress were interested or even willing to investigate the ongoing flow of tax-exempt funds from the U.S. to Jewish Agency and World Zionist Organization operations, even when it was discovered in 2005 that $50 billion had been laundered into financing illegal West Bank settlements. By the beginning of the second millennium, sympathetic modern chroniclers of AIPAC announced that the organization had fully emerged from the Foreign Agents Registration Act gauntlet and was now empowered to act freely, secretly, and in unlimited coordination with the Israeli government. Or at least, this is the assertion of the authors of the 2002 book Jewish Polity and American Civil Society. AIPAC, as previously noted, was registered as a domestic lobby to work on legislation and public policy that enhanced the U.S.-Israel relationship. As such, it may engage in an unlimited amount of congressional lobbying and is free to exchange information with Israeli leadership in carrying out that function. At the same time, it retains full autonomy in deciding when and how to act. No other foreign country claims or enjoys similar lobby-enforced prerogatives in the U.S. Many supporters also repeat Kennan's mantra that AIPAC and its executives transcended FARA oversight through their use of U.S. non-tax-exempt funds, confident that if an assertion is repeated often and broadly enough, history will be ignored. This refrain is also amplified by the U.S. media, which is now generally loath to discuss AIPAC history or initiatives. AIPAC, as the descendant of the American Zionist Council and the Jewish Agency American section, is now running bigger gauntlets than FARA and continues to rely on timely danger alerts from friends in the right places. Like the American Zionist Council, AIPAC has counted on behind-the-scenes political pressure and appeals for leniency to keep regulators and U.S. law enforcement officials at bay. AIPAC has become entangled in many alleged violations, including possessing classified commercial documents, breaking election laws, and, more recently, espionage. In 1984, the FBI found that AIPAC helped Israel negotiate an extremely unfavorable bilateral trade agreement with the U.S. while it was in possession of stolen secret information that U.S. companies had supplied to the International Trade Commission. The FBI was persuaded to drop its criminal investigation of AIPAC, and it was not criminally prosecuted. Between the time it was signed and 2019, the balance of trade adjusted for inflation has shifted from rough parity to a cumulative $182 billion deficit to the United States, the worst of any bilateral deal. Two former AIPAC directors allegedly rigged the 1986 California Senate race by laundering campaign contributions in collusion with a network of cutout campaign donors. One of them, Michael Goland, served a few months of prison time, but the results of the dirty election went unchallenged, and AIPAC's reputation and power over politicians seeking seats in Congress ballooned. AIPAC coordinated political action committee contributions in violation of its nonprofit status to promote its vetted candidates for Congress and pick off foes. This was incontrovertibly revealed by damning internal AIPAC memos published in the Washington Post in 1988. 2 decades later, after reaching the Supreme Court and being sent down to lower courts, a civil case against AIPAC and the Federal Election Commission produced no accountability for violations of rules and statutes over PAC fund donor disclosure. In the years 2004 and 2005, AIPAC received leniency from a prosecutor who indicted AIPAC executives Steve Rosen and Keith Weissman for alleged violations of the 1917 Espionage Act. Rather than extend his investigation and indictments to the entire corporation, former U.S. Attorney Paul McNulty secretly promised AIPAC's legal counsel that he would do all he could to limit the scope of the FBI's criminal investigation. The specifics are detailed in a February 16, 2005 memorandum between Rosen's lawyer, Abby Lowell, and Nathan Lewin, AIPAC's legal counsel. Lewin revealed that the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia and Chief Prosecutor of the case, Paul McNulty, would like to end it all with minimal damage to AIPAC. Lewin further told Lowell that U.S. Attorney McNulty was fighting with the FBI to limit the investigation to Steve Rosen and Keith Weissman and avoid expanding it. Like Katzenbach before him, McNulty subsequently rose to a higher position in the Department of Justice. The upper levels of the Department of Justice continue to be a bastion of Israel lobby leniency. Attorney General Michael Mukasey came under concentrated pressure, loudly voiced in the Wall Street Journal, to quash the trial of Steve Rosen and Keith Weissman even before it began. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency published a thinly veiled call for a popular uprising against the prosecution, titled none too subtly in online news sources as U.S. Jews should rise up against the classified information case the government has brought against 2 former AIPAC employees. The Jewish Agency and World Zionist Organization came under a renewed spotlight in 2005 when former Israeli prosecutor Talia Sasson released a wide-ranging study commissioned by the Israeli Prime Minister in which she documented a vast international money laundering infrastructure centered within the Jewish Agency and controlled by the World Zionist Organization. These and other allegedly charitable organizations had laundered more than $50 billion into illegal Israeli settlements while systematically expropriating and developing land that did not belong to Israel. Reporting on the money laundering scheme even reached USA Today in August of 2005. A report read, Jerusalem, Associated Press. Israel's effort since the 1967 Mideast War to fill the West Bank and Gaza Strip with Jews has grown from the scattered actions of zealous squatters into a network of 142 towns and villages that house nearly 240,000 people. Now that Israel plans to spend some $2 billion to dismantle just 25 of these settlements, for which U.S. aid has been requested, it raises the question of how much money has been poured into populating these biblical lands with Jews and exactly where it came from. The official answer? Nobody knows. Vice President Shimon Peres estimates Israel has spent about $50 billion since 1977. When the hardline Likud government took over from his Labor Party, other former finance ministers and government officials don't discount a price tag, commonly floated but never documented, of $60 billion. Despite its declared opposition to settlements, Washington only began taking action in the early 1990s when Israel sought billions of dollars in U.S. loan guarantees. Washington said it would deduct sums that went into settlements, dollar for dollar. In 2003, when Israel was granted $9 billion in loan guarantees over 3 years, the cut was $289.5 million. Officials familiar with the issue and speaking on the condition of anonymity say that low figure was reached with the help of the influential pro-Israel lobby, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. AIPAC officials refused to discuss the issue on the record, but denied they helped to negotiate the numbers. Israel also used private U.S. donations for which it secured U.S. tax-exempt status, said David Newman, a political scientist at Israel's Ben-Gurion University who researched settlement funding. U.S. tax laws don't exempt donations for political activities such as the settlements. Israel separated the World Zionist Organization from the quasi-governmental Jewish Agency, a move that allowed donors to inject money into settlements without losing tax exemptions. In reality, the two groups operate under one umbrella, with the same officials, departments, and administrators overseeing the activities, Newman said. Perhaps the greatest area is how Israel expropriated, confiscated, or purchased land for settlements, read the USA Today report. The Jewish Agency's money laundering for settlements scheme was designed to utilize U.S. tax-exempt funds from donors to accomplish illegal ends overseas. However, the Sasson report was not formally raised in the U.S. Congress in 2005, and only a few newspapers, such as The Forward, fretted over the implications of the report, most particularly the legal violations covering U.S. charitable fundraising organizations connected to the World Zionist Organization and the Jewish Agency via controlling corporate ties. Its report read, Embarrassed leaders of the American Jewish organizations were absorbing the news this week that an international body under their control was at the center of a tangled Israeli scheme detailed in a bombshell government report to build illegal settlement outposts in violation of Israeli law, policy, and international commitments. The international body, the World Zionist Organization, or WZO, is described in the report as a pivotal player in the scheme, in which mid-level officials in various government ministries secretly channeled funds and resources into illegal West Bank outposts. Several sources told the Forward that a WZO department, the Settlement Division, was used as a vehicle for many of the illegal activities, in part because its status as a non-governmental organization shielded it from government oversight. WZO is a confederation of pro-Israel groups in dozens of countries, including such mainstays as Hadassah, B'nai B'rith, and offshoots of the reform and conservative movements. American groups control 30% of the organization's main governing bodies, including the World Zionist Congress, which is convened in Jerusalem every 4 years. Most leaders of American Zionist groups said they had been unaware of the extent of WZO's work in the territories. The Forward need not have worried too much about the embarrassed leaders or subsequent investigations by U.S. law enforcement. On November 21, 2005, top U.S. law enforcement officials sent representatives to attend a comprehensive briefing on the matter organized by the Council for the National Interest in the Russell Senate office about how U.S. affiliates of charities such as B'nai B'rith and Hadassah had direct control of the World Zionist Organization, and their linkage to the massive money laundering operation mentioned in the report. Department of Justice and Treasury officials were advised about how the money laundering operation is an indirect generator of terrorism against the United States, as illegal settlements, low-intensity conflict, and hopelessness generated asymmetric retaliation against the U.S. They were advised that the majority of the funds were coming from the United States. Barry Sabin, chief of the U.S. Counterterrorism Section, formally thanked the keynote speaker for the presentation, which included straightforward documentary evidence that could have led directly to indictments for money laundering and other violations of the U.S. Criminal Code prohibiting hostile acts against a people with which the U.S. is not at war. To date, however, U.S. law enforcement officials have visibly done nothing to slow or prosecute the parties responsible for this new, and yet very old, charitable money laundering operation. 2 of the officials assigned to attend the briefing were transferred, one to the Department of Justice Antitrust Division. In the U.S. Treasury Department, the money laundering issue has, in a way, been cynically turned on its head. In 2004, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee and its affiliated think tank, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, lobbied for a separate new Treasury unit to be created, an effort reminiscent of the Irgun-inspired Morgenthau days. The Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence is headed by AIPAC-vetted leadership, with many OTFI briefings delivered directly to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's headquarters in Washington, D.C. The Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence secret financial operations that target Iran and its trading partners are tightly coordinated with Israel's leadership, but impenetrable to the American public. Freedom of Information Act requests to this unit, asking for details of the director's many trips to Israel and whether the unit was tackling the issue of U.S. charitable money laundering to West Bank settlements, are met with stonewalling. The Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence Unit claims it will not respond to FOIA requests in order to be in compliance with the Bank Secrecy Act. Ironically, the Bank Secrecy Act is an anti-money laundering law. AIPAC continues to operate clandestinely and is almost impenetrable to regulatory oversight or the scrutiny of the American public. AIPAC employees sign confidentiality agreements long before leaving the organization. AIPAC's domestic lobbying disclosures filed with the House and Senate clerk offices reveal little relevant information about how legislation is lobbied or funds dispersed, nor do they reveal precisely which individuals in Congress and government agency officials are being lobbied, or the organization's far-flung coordination with the Israeli government from AIPAC's Jerusalem office. Indeed, Isaiah Kennan and AIPAC's evasions of FARA oversight created a corporate culture enshrining the concept that because AIPAC is so isolated from public scrutiny, it has transcended U.S. laws. Indicted AIPAC executive Steve Rosen waxed poetic when he stated, "A lobby is like a night flower. It thrives in the dark and dies in the sun." More troubling for Americans, AIPAC's lobbying disclosures, though meager, reveal a major shift beyond its normal focus on lobbying for military appropriations, a huge annual foreign aid package, and punitive legislation against Iran, Syria, and Palestinians. In 2006, AIPAC weighed in on the Lobbyist Reform Act of 2006, which was killed. AIPAC was also active on the Legislative Transparency and Accountability Act of 2006, designed to provide greater transparency with respect to lobbying activities, to amend the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 to clarify when organizations, described in Section 527 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, must register as political committees and for other purposes. That legislation also never became law. AIPAC also helped kill off the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act of 2006, designed to provide more rigorous requirements with respect to disclosure, the enforcement of ethics and lobbying laws and regulations, and for other purposes. In 2007, AIPAC actively lobbied against the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act of 2007 and rules of the House of Representatives for the 110th Congress. AIPAC appears to be attempting to entrench its ill-gotten prerogatives through denial of lobbying reform and subtle and complex changes to U.S. legal code. In 2005, AIPAC's overreach finally brought two of its executives closer to the bar of justice for alleged Espionage Act violations. Lawrence Franklin, Stephen J. Rosen, and Keith Weissman are symbols of AIPAC's gambit for power. The right to front-run and shape U.S. policymaking by freely dispersing not the Mufti of Jerusalem's diaries, but the most sensitive U.S. national security information from the Pentagon. The operation was an attempt to create facts on the ground and gross subversions of the U.S. national interest. Isaiah Kennan stopped registering as a foreign agent because compliance with the U.S. disclosure law would have revealed his activities, just as it did for those of Marion Javits, Billy Carter, and Igor Cassini. The law, if applied, would tend to thwart AIPAC's core objectives. While there can be little doubt that other lobby organizations have probably also successfully passed through the FARA gauntlet, the passage of time and declassification of documents gradually reveals the damage done by Kennan and the Israel lobby. The secrecy that veils both government and AIPAC operations usually prevented American citizens from demanding redress. Absent timely, accurate information about what the Israel lobby and its allies and government are doing, oversight and informed consent is impossible. In the history of special interest group politics, this is nothing new, but in this particular case, it is more pronounced by the recurring nature of illegalities and the institutionalized veil of secrecy. An analysis of the release dates and classified government documents, revelations from insiders, and public works of forensic historians cited in this book reveals a stunning fact. On average, critical information about major initiatives and data critical to Middle East policy formulation become publicly available approximately 40 years after the opportunity for response has passed. Isaiah L. Kennan also briefly commented on the effect of declassifying documents from his own unique perspective. I've often written about the 1947 fall session of the General Assembly, which voted for partition. But it was not until 1975 that I learned the inside story from declassified documents. That session was a production and double talk on a double stage. Up front, we listened to formal discussion and debate. Backstage, American diplomacy was maneuvering to defeat the partition resolution, to substitute a plan for trusteeship from a tiny Vatican-like Jewish cultural and religious center. According to custom, the Department of State declassifies and publishes diplomatic correspondence and documents after 25 years. The book recording, The 1947-48 papers was published a year late, but the declassified documents were available in the National Archives. In the summer of 1975, I wrote a syndicated article describing what went on behind the scenes and disclosing Marshall's startling threat to vote against Truman if he recognized Israel. Backstage, a caucus of the U.S. delegation on September 15, Marshall warned that acceptance of the UNSCOP recommendations would provoke a very violent Arab reaction. Kennan obviously approved of neither Secretary of State Marshall's analysis nor his responsibilities to align U.S. policy with broader national interests. But ironically, not only was Marshall's analysis proven to be largely correct, he's one of the last secretaries of states with the courage to stand up to the president. In a 60th anniversary speech on the establishment of Israel before the American Jewish Conference, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice mentioned Marshall's challenging and threatening Truman as an example of an approach she would never follow. But while Marshall's legacy, encapsulated in the plan for reconstructing Europe after World War II that bears his names, remains fairly secure, Kennan's, as mentioned in the introduction, is treated like a skeleton in AIPAC's dark and deepening closet. When it comes to improving Middle East policy formulation, the U.S. does not need new laws. Simple enforcement of the spirit and letter of important laws long on the books would substantially improve policy and make the government more responsive to broader American interests. But U.S. agencies appear to be moving in the opposite direction. Additional special waivers covering Israel lobby transgressions have recently been implemented by allies ensconced in government, sometimes publicly referred to as the state secret privilege or threats to sensitive diplomatic relations. These blanket waivers can be applied to trump almost any apparent criminality or violation of U.S., Israeli, or international law and bail out key members of the Israel lobby when their activities or illicit gains are exposed. As a power claimed by the executive branch, this waiver seems permanent and irrevocable, has little public recourse, and, like presidential pardons, is rarely deeply questioned by mainstream news media. As a shield against foreign isms, FARA is now only as strong as the target against which it is applied is weak. If the target is successfully entrenched and empowered in the U.S., even by illegal means, FARA is never applied. Like claims of attorney-client privilege, FARA cannot weather a state secrets claim, no matter how blatant the appearance of a cover-up. Little public reaction to this abuse has been forthcoming. The beneficiaries of FARA enforcement are diffuse, heterogeneous, and generally unaware of the violations or the negative impact that the lack of enforcement is having on them. They are the unaware and under-informed majority of Americans. The key perpetrators and beneficiaries of FARA violations are usually elite, connected, and both willing and able to fight back through legal and other means. While they frequently do not serve the interests they claim to represent, they are buttressed by the perception of unchallengeable power and connections. Yet this power can and must be challenged. Vocal U.S. critics of the lobby are seemingly few in number, highly visible, easy to isolate, and generally their calls for law enforcement or justice fall on deaf ears, or are stymied by institutional memories of the caveat. This elite crime, unlike street crime, is now rarely prosecuted when warranted. Failing to file an accurate declaration of activity, whether it's a tax return or FARA declaration, is a crime that gradually takes its toll. Lack of prosecution begins to create a serious drag on society and has a corrosive effect on public law abidance. Enforcement malaise causes entities in many sectors, from business to nonprofits to individuals, to question whether they are suckers for paying their fair share, playing by the rules, or disclosing relevant information that being a citizen of the United States sometimes demands. It's not controversial to observe that the creation of Israel immediately touched off conflicts in the Middle East affecting all Americans. Major questions and even a common approach toward a solution remains unresolved to this day. We make the case here that factors driving key U.S. policy are rarely publicly known when they are actually always in play. In this way, the power democracy gives Americans at the voting booth and in Congress has already been largely subverted on all matters related to foreign policy in the Middle East. Unfortunately for everyone, the United States It's also a country where grievances, building invisibly against large injustices, have a way of exploding suddenly and violently after high officials charged with enforcement and justice fail to uphold the law. The cauldron of U.S. Middle East policy, according to Rabbi Berger, has long been building up steam. He said, "From then on, nothing that developed in American policy surprised me. After 20 years, I saw the old hackneyed pattern being replayed. The decisions would be made on the basis of political considerations by the politicians in the White House. The objective facts, the merits of the cases of several parties to the long-festering conflict, sophisticated judgments of American long-range interests in the Middle East would all be tabled or assigned to levels of secondary importance. Representing a state with no constitution, the World Zionist Organization, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and by extension the entire Israel lobby, are able to quickly morph into whatever thin legal structure is necessary to carry out the objective. History reveals that by the time a major effort is made to hold it to account, it will already be operating under a different umbrella. FARA was one of the most intelligent and noble attempts to codify and enforce the original vision of the Logan Act, and with proper resources and critically firm political backing from the executive on down, it could have secured broad American interests as envisioned by its framers. Instead, with nearly a century of perspective, it is obvious that when FARA faced its biggest challenge, it completely failed the American people. The declassified FARA section memos cited here provide a Rosetta Stone for translating what has long been only suspected. Public officials responsible for upholding the rule of law are actively thwarted on enforcement matters concerning the Israel lobby. In the 1950s, when Isaiah Kennan was leaving his job as a public relations operative for the Israeli Office of Information, his main objective was to bypass the U.S. State Department and direct pressure toward the U.S. Congress via foreign-funded public relations and tenuous claims of grassroots constituents. By 1973, Kennan was able to boast $1 billion per year in U.S. aid to Israel. And when Kennan retired in 1974, he still retained his editor emeritus title at the Near East Report. The spirit of AIPAC's hardball and often illegal tactics continued long after Kennan left the scene, and the results are staggering. By the time of Kennan's death in 1988, U.S. aid to Israel exceeded $3 billion a year, the highest amount given to any country. This would not have been possible absent the American Zionist Council's early subventions from the Jewish Agency. An argument could be made that the foreign aid extracted from U.S. taxpayers under such circumstances should be returned with interest. But under the present circumstances, even discussing disgorgement is difficult because relevant information has been generally unavailable to American citizens. Attempts to seek justice in open debate generate waves of capable opponents. And, as mentioned, the ability to execute hooking points by threatening to drag high officials from almost any agency into potential criminal prosecutions while securing state secrets and sensitive diplomatic relations blankets over its new forays from friends in high places has vastly expanded the Israel lobby's power. What becomes more obvious with each passing year is that in charting this course toward institutional power, Kennan and the lobby seem to be following the advice of Julius Caesar. "If you must break the law," he said, "do it to seize power. In all other cases, observe it." Now that operatives of the lobby Kennan helped create are calling the shots and entrenching themselves ever deeper into all branches of government, they naively expect the humble acquiescence of Americans, impoverished by war and angered by the guile, misdirection of resources, and corruption of U.S. government agencies. American policy malfeasance in the Middle East has caused many to seek out the authors, individual and institutional, of the decades of debacle, war, and debasement of America and how it came to be. I hope we've provided a few formerly elusive answers to these historic questions. AIPAC, in its various permutations, has been at the forefront of a great many efforts that directly challenge rule of law and governance in the United States. Unfortunately for America, these types of elite threats have a real grassroots corrective. As awareness builds, endemic corruption soon becomes perceived as a public threat to the safety, livelihood, and quality of life of all citizens. Economic studies have shown that when governance, that is, political accountability, and the ability of bureaucracy to enforce the rule of law go into systemic decline, a nation's people literally become impoverished. According to The Economist, in the long run, a country's income per head rises by roughly 300% if it improves its governance by one standard deviation. One standard deviation is roughly the gap between India's and Chile's rule of law scores measured by the bank. As it happens, Chile is about 300% richer than India in purchasing power terms, said The Economist. Although rule of law is laudable for its own sake, poverty is an inevitable consequence of turning a blind eye on decades of depredations. Just as improving the rule of law produces societal and economic benefits, the reverse is also true. The U.S. is now entering a period of decline prompted by disastrous Middle East policies produced by a formulation system that has been thoroughly corrupted. But the long period of public acquiescence may be drawing to a close. The descendants of Senator Fulbright, Lessing Rosenwald, Nathan B. Lenvin, Rabbi Berger, Irene Bowman, and multitudes of disenfranchised citizens across America may be gradually beginning to assemble.